Amen. Well, we are beginning an adventure here. We're going to be going through the book of Romans. So if you got one of those little books, hopefully you grabbed one of those and you can kind of highlight and write notes, or there's the note pages that are out there. You can also go online to fscdumas.com and hit Sundays, and then there's a little thing for notes there as well. So lots of ways to kind of keep track of stuff, because we're going to cover a lot. We're going to go through the book of Romans over the next couple of months and take a little break and then finish it up. But we got to kind of understand some things before we dig into it. So let me start by saying this. Paul is not what we think he is. He's not just some guy writing some notes, writing some letters to churches. Paul's got a certain personality, certain characteristics, certain character trait that I would probably guess most churches in America would not ask him to come speak, because he's different. He comes at it. He comes at things so differently, especially the way that we think in our Western culture, that I think he would be offensive more than he would be encouraging. And what's interesting is, here's the thing about Paul. Here's a guy who was persecuting and trying to kill Christians. And then he encounters Jesus. And from that moment on, he never lost sight of who Jesus is, and he never lost perspective at the brevity of life. Every second mattered to him. Every moment that he got a chance to share the gospel, he was going to do it. And he did not care whether you liked what he said or not, or how he said it, or if it made sense. He wanted to make sure that he took every moment to direct people towards the gospel. And so when he writes the book of Romans, he is writing and saying some things that just have to be said, because life is short. And if we don't get it, we're not going to get it. So he knows how to say things, and he knows how to communicate things, and he wants to make sure we get it right so that we understand it. And he wants as many people to hear and see the gospel as often as possible. And so this is a letter. It's a letter of 16 chapters. We call it a book, but it's actually a letter written to the Roman church. And it's got some beautiful wording and phrasing that we'll see in it. It's also very honest. It's very clear. It's very deep. No matter who you are or how long you've been a Christian, it's going to wreck you in one way or another. It's very encouraging. It's inspiring. But it's also convicting. It's kind of like, and I hate this illustration, but I like it. It's kind of like the Chuck Norris of the books of the Bible. Sprinkled with these moments of like grandma's cookies and a hug. It's like he hugs you and then kicks you, and hugs you and kicks you. This is what Paul does. And I ran across this a few years ago, a Twitter thing. Have you ever heard the Chuck Norris jokes? I'm not going to get into all of the Chuck Norris jokes, but basically always the premise is he could walk into a room and beat everybody up just by looking at him, kind of things. It's always those. Well, there's a guy who has kind of done a satirical thing on Twitter called Pastor Church Norris. And he's got some funny phrases. This would be Paul. This would be the jokes about Paul. Here's a few of the quotes that he's done. The Pastor Church Norris quotes. I roundhouse kicked a book and the author got saved. That makes sense. I often wrestle with deep theological questions until they scream for mercy. Yeah, that would be Paul. When I raise my hand during worship, it's because I'm getting high fives from the angels. Okay, that's a little extreme, right? This one is good. I answered the phone this morning and it was the wrong number, and I'm baptizing their entire family. I mean, that is Paul. Like, you just interact with him. He is the Chuck Norris of all the apostles. I think Peter or James might be the Mr. T, don't pity, I pity the fool type thing. But Paul, he's just different. He comes at it hard and fast, but also loving and kind and intimate. And so I'm going to encourage you over the next few weeks that to pay attention, not to just what we talk about on Sunday, but I want you to wrestle with it throughout the week. And if you do that, I promise you're going to be changed, no matter how long you've been a Christian, or even if you don't believe in God, I'm telling you, it's going to change you. But if we limit this book to what somebody has told us, or what we think it says, or maybe a verse that we like or don't like, if we do that, we're going to miss out on the depth and the intricacy of this book. And so I'm going to challenge you to remove all those limitations of what somebody else has told you about the book of Romans. They are probably wrong. Even if I have told you something about the book of Romans, I'm probably wrong. Because that's Paul's point. He is going after some things that we just naturally start to believe about things. And he's moving on those, and he's pushing back on some of those. And so we need to step back from all the ideology and all the theology of what we think of grace, what we think of salvation, what we think of faith, what we think of how we're supposed to be. Remove all of that, step back from that, and just let the word speak. Romans is written with the purpose to get right what we've so often gotten wrong. So in this letter, Paul is deeply theological, but he's also intimately expressive with how God loves us and how it can change us. So the entire book is really kind of if you want to kind of package it, it's all about our problem is sin, and God's solution, which is grace, and then our response, which is worship. It's kind of broken down to that from time to time. You go from the beginning to the end, and you kind of feel that all throughout it. It's designed to help us understand the severity of our problem, but the severity of his solution for our problem, and the severity of our need to respond to God. It's going to challenge us. It's going to get us thinking. So let me give you a quick 2-minute history lesson of the book of Romans, so you know where it's coming from, because this helps us understand Paul's motive and what he's saying and why he says the way he says things. All right, so first of all, in Acts chapter 18, the church in Rome is established. And then shortly after that, there's an emperor by the Emperor Claudius is kind of over all of Rome, and especially the city. And all of a sudden, he begins to feel threatened by this Christian thing, this Christian idea. It starts to push back on all the things that he thinks are important. And so, because it's a Christian thing, and because it seems like Jews have started it, he decides to kick out all of the Jews out of Rome. He kicks all of the Jews out, whether they're Christians or not. 5 years later, he dies. During that time, the church has continued to thrive, but the church has thrived without all of the Old Testament books and philosophies and laws and all that stuff. The Roman Christians have continued to grow in their faith, but they're not doing all the things that the Jews did or the Jews thought were important. But now, after Claudius is dead, the Jews come back, and they're starting to come back to the church, and they're like, hey, Roman Christians, you guys aren't quite doing this right. And the Roman Christians are going, no, we don't need to do all that stuff. And so there's this divide that is beginning to happen within this church. The Jewish Christians are kind of trying to push the Roman Christians to do all the stuff that was found in the Old Testament, like you got to worship this way, or you've got to eat, you can eat this, but you can't eat that. Or the worst one for all the men, you got to be circumcised. And the Roman Christians are like, why? Why? We've been able to worship God. We've been growing in our faith. Why do we have to add all this into it? And so this letter that Paul writes, he's trying to bring the church and unify the church together. And so he explains what the gospel is. And really, because that is what is the unit, that's what brings unity within the church, is the gospel. Chapter 1, Paul is going to establish our wickedness, our problem. And we're not going to see a lot of that today. We'll see it more next week. But it really is, chapter 1 is kind of about our wickedness. The second chapter is that there's really nothing we can do. In fact, if chapter 1 is kind of directed at the Roman Christians, chapter 2 is directly connected to the Jewish Christians. And basically he lays out, there's nothing you can do to get right before God. It doesn't matter if you follow all that stuff. That's not what makes you right before God. And then in chapter 3, he unveils God's plan. We've heard it. For all of sin falls short of the glory of God. And in that passage, he begins to unveil the plan for all of us. Then chapter 4 kind of digs into about how both the Jews and the Gentiles are united by being declared righteous before God. And in chapter 5 and 6, he begins to unpack this kind of new humanity. We're going to stop in chapter 6 at the end of March because we're going to get into Easter. And then we're going to pick up chapter 7 and beyond starting in September. So we'll take a little bit of a pause, and we'll kind of need it because there's a lot to unpack in the whole thing. This is kind of a deep and wide letter. It's very wide. Anybody, no matter where you're at, anybody and everybody, wherever you're at in your faith, you can step in and get the basic truths. But it's also very deep because no matter who you are, anybody and everybody, no matter how long they've been in the faith, there's something to learn from it and something that is going to change the way you think in it. All right? Romans chapter 1. Get your Bibles out. We're going to go through this together. Romans chapter 1. Follow with me. We're going to read a few verses here in chapter 1. We're going to skip a little section, not because it's not important, but I'll explain why we're going to kind of jump it here in a second. We're going to start in verse 1, go down to through verse 7, and then we'll jump to the end right here. It says this in Romans 1. Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, also as an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So right now we're seeing who the author is. Very clear. Verse 3, concerning his son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who is a descendant of David according to the flesh, and was appointed to be the powerful Son of God according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection of the dead. Through him we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all Gentiles, including you who are also called by Jesus Christ. To all who are in Rome, loved by God, called as saints, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Jump down to verse 16 and 17. Verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and also to the Greek, for it is the righteousness of God, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So, let's kind of unpack this. Let's go back to the beginning of the chapter, and we're going to kind of unpack bits and pieces of it. And in this, you can highlight some stuff and maybe write some stuff down or get at least an idea of where he's going, because Paul says a lot in just the first few verses, and he says a lot in verses 8 through 15, but again, we're kind of jumping that for a second, because then when he gets to 16 and 17, this is the heart, this is the theme, this is the thesis of what he's writing about. All right, so chapter 1, starting in verse 1, it says this, that Paul is a servant, called as an apostle, but check this part out, set apart for the gospel of God. I want you to kind of sit on that for a second. Why does he use the phrase set apart? Well, this is a very common phrasing, and whether they were Roman or Jew, they would have understood what he was saying. For the Jew, back in Leviticus 20, they heard God and they felt as if God said, you are the chosen people. And God did that. And so they felt like, as Jews, that they were set apart from everybody else. They were the chosen ones. And they have got to represent a relationship with God. But the Romans also felt the same way. They were set apart because they were Roman citizens. Everyone bowed to Rome. And so both of these have this idea of being set apart, but Paul uses a very interesting phrase to quantify who he's set apart for. Did you catch it? Set apart for the gospel of God. Paul, he was a Roman citizen. He was a Roman citizen of citizens. And he was also a Jew. And he followed all the laws of the Jews. He followed everything. He was the top of both sides. And yet he goes, I was never set apart to be a Roman or a Jew. I'm set apart for the gospel of God. And when Paul says things like this, he's not just quantifying himself, he's also inferring that all Christians are set apart. We'll see that in a second. So here he says he's set apart for the gospel of God. In one sense, this is a wink and a nod towards the Jewish people who thought they were set apart for something special. But he is telling them everything in the Old Testament has been about this moment and have been about being set apart for God. And then he kind of looks at the Romans and he says, you know, your gods that are disconnected, all those gods that you worship that seem to be self-absorbed and only worried about themselves and really distant from us. No, we're set apart for the God who wants a relationship with us. Jump down to verse 5, look at this. He goes on and he says, through him we have received grace. And he goes on and he says, to bring about the obedience of faith, including you who are called. You see, here's what he's saying here. And he'll get into this deeper. But what he's inferring here is that true grace is not a license to live however you want. It's not a license to just be who you are. Jesus didn't come and die on the cross so you could just continue to be the way you were. He came to change you. There's power behind that. And when you receive that grace, you're called to something else. Called to obedience. So if we think grace is an excuse to just keep on sinning or live the way we want, we don't get grace. And Paul knows that if we don't get grace, we may not receive the grace we thought we were getting. In fact, if we get this wrong, we may not really be followers of Christ. He's coming at it hard, isn't he? He's not holding back. He even mentions in just this beginning that true grace leads to obedience. And so he'll unpack that some more. But then he uses his phrase, he says that we are all called. We're all summoned by God. It's as if God calls us into his court and says, now we can have a relationship. Now we can work together. Now we can be together. And it's only by my grace, through your faith in me as God, that we can have this relationship. You've got to trust, you've got to have faith that Jesus died on the cross for you. And that means something, and now that turns into something where you and I can have this growing relationship. Then he gets into verses 8 through 15. And this is, the reason why we're jumping this is very intimate language that he's writing to this Roman church. He's really letting them know how much he cares about them. Because he knows that what he's going to say in the next few verses and the next few chapters is going to be hard for them to hear for a while. Because they're going to feel like he's beating up on them. And he really doesn't want them to feel that way. And so he is very compassionate and very intimate in his expression towards them. But then he gets down to the heart of what he wants to say. Look at verse 16. And we're going to unpack this one a little bit. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. He's not worried about being canceled. He's not worried how people are going to view him. He's not worried about what people are going to say about him. He's not ashamed of the gospel. The gospel has changed him. He has never lost sight of what God has done for him. He's never lost sight of what Jesus did when he came and talked to Paul on that road and changed Paul's life forever. He's never lost sight of who Jesus is and the gospel that he came, the good news that he came to die for him. He was one persecuting the Christians and trying to kill them. And here's Jesus saying, I forgive you. Your sin is what I died for. Think about this for a second. What does the gospel mean for you? What's interesting is what Paul does in the next thing is he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, and then he gives us a description of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. It is the power of God for salvation. Is there any power greater than the power of the gospel? Think of all the superhero powers that we've always thought would be kind of cool to have, right? It'd be cool to be able to fly, to be like Superman, or maybe to be like Wonder Woman and have cool bracelets or something. I don't know, and a cool lasso. Whatever it is, right? We think of all these superhero powers. Think about it. None of those powers, even though they're all fake, none of those powers save somebody from eternity. None of them. They might save a person. Superman might swoop in and save a person from falling from a building and dying, but eventually that person's going to die. Something's going to happen. They're still going to die, no matter what he does. But the power of God for salvation is eternal. What power is there that's greater than that? See, that's the good news. That is the gospel that Paul is conveying. The good news is powerful enough to save us for eternity. If you want kind of a clear description, Paul, every time he writes a letter, he describes the gospel a little differently based on the group of people that he's writing to and what they understood about the gospel. And one of the most wrecked churches that had lost complete sight of the gospel is the Corinthian church. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he unpacks what the gospel is, probably in the clearest context that he could to a group of people who have completely lost sight. Go back and study that, look at that this week. It might give you an idea. But here's the whole concept, that Paul, what he's doing is he's trying to explain that the gospel is not just information, but it's transformation. The gospel is not just going to be some information that's good to know in my head, but it's going to transform us. He goes on, look at what he says in the next part of verse 16. Is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. So he's described what the gospel is, and now he says, well, who's it for? It's for everyone. Notice that he didn't distinguish what he meant by everyone right away. He says, for everyone who believes. And then he goes ahead and he says, for the Jew and the Greek. For both of you. See, biblical belief for Paul was a lifestyle. It was a lifestyle that anyone could jump into. It wasn't just a mindset. Biblical belief, whenever you see the word believe in the Bible, it is never talking about a mindset. I believe Jesus died, I'm good enough. It always is transformational. It's always a lifestyle change. Paul, when he believed in Jesus, he did not continue to go around and persecute Christians and kill them. Something changed. When Peter, when the disciples finally decided to really believe in Jesus when he had risen from the dead and he comes to them and he forgives them, something changes about them. There's something that changes inside of us that transforms us. And then he distinguishes first to the Jew and to the Greek, not because he's trying to bring up who was first and who was last. It's not what he's saying. But what he's describing is that it doesn't matter your race, your gender, your age, your past religion or your beliefs. He begins to level the playing field. In fact, when he gets into verses 18 on, that we'll look at next week, he's really kind of focusing on some of the belief systems or some of the upbringing of a lot of the Roman people, the Roman Christians, and he's revealing some things that are pretty hard to hear and difficult for them to wrestle with. But what he lays out is that we are all wicked. We are all wicked. In chapter 2, when he starts talking about the things that the Jews would have understood to make them righteous, he goes like, nope, that doesn't work. He gets to this point in chapter 3, we've heard it. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So he describes what the gospel is. He describes who it's for. And then look what he says next. Verse 17. For in it, in what? The gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Now, when Paul does things like this, when it's like faith to faith, when there's kind of like a repetitive type of thing, he's using kind of a literary phrasing that would have made sense to that culture. Maybe we don't pick up on it, but it's this kind of it's kind of a common tool that writers would use to emphasize a repeating action. That it goes from faith to faith to faith to faith. And in essence, from generation to generation to generation, it's practiced by this one, and it's passed on to this one, and it's passed on to this one, and it's passed on to this one. And so the actions and the reactions of our faith growing goes on and on and on to our kids and to their kids and to their kids and to their kids. And our faith goes on and on in our relationship, from this relationship to this relationship to this relationship to this relationship. He says the gospel is the righteousness of God revealed in those relationships. And when you see it lived out, it causes you to want to live it out a little bit more. And it causes the people around you to want to live it out a little bit more. And it continues on and on and on. He goes on. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. And then he says this, he quotes Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. And he does this in a couple other letters that he writes. The righteous will live by faith. He repeats this in Galatians, and then the writer of Hebrews, if it was Paul or whoever wrote Hebrews, they repeat the same thing. Whenever they call back to the Old Testament, you got to understand, Paul quotes the Old Testament more in the book of Romans than any other letter he writes. Because he wants us to understand that the things in the Old Testament have always been pointing towards this moment, to when Jesus would come, to when the good news would happen. So God has done his part. He's done exactly what he said he would do. He's done what he always planned to do, and now it's time for us to do our part. Here's the big idea that I think we can catch on to, and it starts this week, and again, it goes into next week. But what we begin to see at this beginning part is that the gospel is far more powerful than we know. Have you ever thought of the power of the gospel being for salvation, for eternity? Yeah, kind of. But when Jesus died on the cross and he was risen from the dead, that means we no longer have to worry about our eternity. There's power behind that. And that power is not just a thought, but it's a life change. It changes everything in us. But until we get the second part of this, we may not really understand the power of the gospel. Because while the gospel is far more powerful than we know, we are far more wicked than we think. None of us want to be as wicked as that guy or that gal. We don't. We don't think we're like them. But Paul, he's getting ready to level the playing field. He's getting ready to get us all on the same page that we are all wicked. But the power of the gospel has the potential to change all of that. I think there's kind of a surprising connection that we see in the book of Romans. Think about this. Paul, he's grown up in a culture that their main educational tool was the Old Testament. And he achieved such great success educationally that he was asked to come on and be taught by rabbis as he got older. So more than likely, by the time we hear about Paul the first time he is Saul in Acts, more than likely he has the entire Old Testament memorized. The entire thing. He could quote it from the beginning to the end. You start picking out a verse, he can pick out all the verses around it. He knows exactly where it's at. And so if Paul has this mindset, what would be going through his mind is that God in Genesis 1 and 2 created everything, put everything together, and wanted a relationship with us. He made mankind for a relationship and to worship him. But mankind's selfishness and sin and wickedness has separated him from God. And so what does God do in the good news? You see, the Jewish focus was always about God is so holy, and God is a God of wrath, and God is going to punish you if you mess up, and God is going to come get you if you're doing wrong, and he will kill you if he wants to. It was all this negativity, right? That was the Jewish culture that he grew up in. And Paul's saying, that's not the God that I know. That's the God that I've always been told, but that's not the God that I know. Think about all the Roman people that have grown up without an understanding of God, and they have these gods who are self-absorbed and they don't care about anybody. He's like, no, that's not the God that I know. And so in Genesis 1 and 2, we see this creation and this fall of man, but then Paul starts to piece it together, and he says, but this is God's response, God's solution. The very nature of God is that mankind is his creation. And the only thing that can fix it is his righteousness. And man can't do anything to be righteous enough. And so God sent his son to die on the cross. It's revealed in his gospel. The idea that God would send his son changes everything that all of them would have understood. And now because of Jesus, all of the Old Testament begins to make sense. The righteous will live by faith. So I want us to think for a second. I want us to pause right there for a second. Instead of coming up with 3 things that we can do, or I just want us to pause on this fact of the power of the gospel for a second. Do we understand belief? If we just had these 16 verses, if we just had verses 16 and 17, would we be able to understand what it means to believe in God? If that's all we had, yeah, I think the Spirit could help us do that. Obviously, there's other passages and other sections of the passage that we're going to unpack. But here's the thought. According to Paul, the gospel reveals God's righteousness. The gospel is way more powerful than we thought. Do we get it? Do we understand that? See, Paul, where he's at, just kind of go with me where he's at. He is looking at this awesome, this powerful, this life-changing, this amazingly creative, this overwhelmingly holy God who has sent his son for us. This God is forgiving. He's affectionate. He's perfect. He's made everything that is wrong with us right. He's given us the power of salvation. Paul's life is completely altered by this fact. And so what does he say? The righteous will live by faith. It's the power of God for salvation. It's for anyone. It's been revealed. It's possible for us to live righteously before God because of what Jesus did. The gospel has the power not just to save us, but it has the power to change us. And depending on where you're at, in the whole idea of where God is, who God is, whether you believe or don't, whether you've believed him for a long time, whether you've wrestled with your faith, or maybe you feel solid in your faith. Paul wants us to stop and pause for a moment and think about the power of his salvation. How has it changed you? How has it moved in you? How has it influenced you? What does it cause you to want to do? You see, for Paul, if he was preaching in this moment, he would say, we got to sing something. We got to respond somehow. There's got to be something welling up inside of us when we begin to understand that power, that it is so life-changing that we can't help but hold it in anymore. You see, this amazing God has done something that we've never, ever experienced. This last week, Rachel and JL and I went out around 11 o'clock at night, 10 o'clock at night, took Rachel's telescope out into the 16 degree weather. It was awful. And we decided to go look for something. I don't know if you realize, but this last week, there's a comet. It's been kind of around, but for the last few weeks where it's been visible. But there's been a comet that has Scientists say it only comes around once every 50,000 years, and if you understand how long the world has been around, this is the first time it's ever happened. It's the first time this comet has ever been visible. So we got the telescope out, and we are freezing. Jail's laying down inside the truck with the truck on because it's cold out. Rachel and I are shivering, trying to work this telescope. And if you've ever tried to use a telescope, it's hard to get it to point at something because when you move it, it's moving a lot, but it's hard to find stuff. And so we got the binoculars out, and we're looking up, and finally, I think I see it. And we finally get the telescope, and I'm looking around, and finally we get a glimpse of it. Can I tell you, it was the most boring thing we've ever done. It was this green smudge. That's all it was. But can I tell you something? While I don't understand, and I didn't get a full view of what that comet was and what that moment is, I also didn't realize the awesomeness of the moment, because it's the first time that's ever been seen. First time. It's never happened before on earth. That is what Paul is feeling and thinking when he says the righteousness of God is the power for salvation through the gospel.